Welcome to Genetics 3. So far, we've done some basic concepts, and then we had a good discussion in Genetics 2 about gene action, dominant recessive, incomplete dominance, epistasis, and so forth. And then I actually thought, man, I still have more to talk about. So I'm subtitling this More Basic Concepts in Animal Genetics. Okay? So, as a little introduction of what we're going to do for the first part here, I want to talk about these three concepts that I just put in the middle of the screen. And often these things get messed up, especially on the internet. So I want to talk about sex-limited traits. And we're going to have a little discussion on each of these, but briefly, that's where traits are only expressed in one of the sexes. Sex-influenced traits are expressed in both sexes, but to a larger degree in one of the sexes or the other, right? Male or female. And then the sex-linked traits, those are the ones that come on the sex chromosomes. The other two, the top two, are in the autosomes. So very interesting. So let's get to sex-limited traits. Okay, sex-limited traits. These are, and notice how I said genes, and then, the genes code for traits. So sometimes you'll see it sex-limited genes, but that's, it's better to say sex-limited traits because the genes are present in both sexes on the autosomes, usually, almost always, probably. We'll just say it always on the autosomes. Remember, that's all the chromosomes except the sex chromosomes. And then a trait, though, however, it's present in both sexes on the chromosome someplace, it's only expressed in one of the sexes. So, in other words, it's impossible for one sex to express these traits, although they're in all the genes, okay? And one great example is lactation, okay? So lactation is really a female phenomenon, right? After the female in our pets, dogs, cats, and horses, after they go through a pregnancy, give birth, then we have lactation. And by the way, I've got the dog picture here. You should know that when a dog is lactating, that's an incredible nutrient drain on her body, and she needs the best nutrition she ever had. The more puppies, the more nutrition she has, especially when the puppies get to be like 3 to 5 weeks of age. They are really consuming a lot of milk, takes a lot of energy. The dam, right, the female, is probably losing weight. But it should be noted that the genes for lactation are also present in the male. And maybe you're not familiar with the dairy industry, but they select dairy sires based on the sire's progeny, how much milk the progeny, obviously the female progeny, which we call heifers/cows. And you can genetically select for milk production by using very superior males. So that proves the genes are in both sexes. And although the male doesn't milk, if you look at their offspring, you could predict how good of genes the male has for milk production. And then I just found this other cute picture, and I think some of you have seen this picture. This is a tiger that adopted 5 piglets, and the piglets are kind of camouflaged. And I've seen other pictures where they're not wearing their camo, let's put it that way. And I do believe this tiger was lactating. So I think these 5 piglets were adopted by this tiger. And you've seen other pictures where, let's say, kittens are milking a dog, or, nursing is probably the better term. So it's kind of interesting all that can happen. Now, let me tell you a few other sex-limited traits. Okay? In the human population, beard growth is basically a male phenomenon, right? But the genes would be present in both the male and the female. Remember, these are sex limited. So think of it as The genes are present in both sexes, but only one can really express the trait. What else do I have over here? Tail feathers in chickens. Roosters have really long tail feathers, but the female will never, although the female has the genes, but they're not expressed. And then finally, cryptorchidism. If you remember, we talked about that a while ago, and that's where one or both of the testes fails to descend out of the body cavity into the scrotum, because the testes actually develop in the body cavity and then they travel down to the testis. And cryptorchidism is another example of a sex-limited trait. Now we're ready to talk about sex-influenced traits. Hopefully you're following along. Here's my definition. Genes, and remember I'm going to say traits underneath there so you can follow this, but it's the genes that are present on the chromosomes, right? That's the genotype. The traits are really kind of like the phenotype, but I just want to make sure you follow along that the genes are present in both sexes again, just like we had before. But it's on the chromosomes, autosomes. The trait is expressed in both sexes. Now that's different than the sex-limited we just talked about. Here, these traits are expressed in both sexes, but there's a little proviso. However, they tend to be expressed more frequently in one of the sexes. One or both of the, well, in one of the sexes. One of two of the sexes. So let's talk about baldness. Here's a famous actor. Bald, pretty much so. Male. And then here's a female. Probably not an actress. I don't know who she is. But they're both bald, but it ends up being, you'll see a lot more male baldness than you do female baldness. Okay? So that's one sex-influenced trait. And I'm going to get rid of those two because now I've got another example here. Horns is another great example of sex-influenced traits. In bulls, the trait tends to be dominant. And if you remember right, if you have a dominant trait and there's only two alleles, if it's dominant, all you need is one copy of the horn allele to be expressed, right? You'd have one copy or both, you'll get horns. So in bulls, the male, horns tend to be a dominant trait. But in females, the trait is recessive. So you can definitely see this is a female, a cow. There's the udder, the mammary gland, if you're not familiar with that terminology. The udder, and then horns. So it's a sex-influenced trait, expressed more in one of the sexes, and we had two examples, the baldness in humans and horns in cattle. Sometimes it's very hard to pick out examples from our companion animals. There's maybe no good example, or we haven't found out exactly in pets. Okay, now we're on sex-linked traits. A sex-linked trait. Well, here it is. It's got to be on the sex chromosomes, either the X, which it usually is, or the Y. But a lot of times it's restricted to the X. And then I've got to remind you that females are XX, so the two X chromosomes can work together, whereas males are XY. So sometimes in males, if there's one copy of something on the X chromosome, even if it's recessive, it's going to be expressed because there's not another X chromosome. In females, then they have two X chromosomes, so it's going to have more interaction, and a recessive isn't going to be likely to be expressed because maybe the other allele has a dominant trait. Okay, so definitely sex-linked. The genes, again, I'm going to say traits, but the traits aren't on the sex chromosomes. It's actually the genes that code for traits, but I just want to not make sure I don't lose anybody. And it's usually the X chromosome versus the Y. And about the only good example I could find is color blindness in humans. more men tend to be colorblind. And I guess, well, I got some other examples too. The red-green color blindness. Um, and let me show you, well, I guess I'll name off my list here. There's a type of muscular dystrophy also that tends to be sex-linked in humans. Then there's a male pattern baldness that's attributed to the sex-linked traits. That's different than the baldness I had talked about earlier. And then hemophilia, definitely an X-linked trait, way more often expressed in the male because the male only has one X chromosome. Let me show you my illustration for the color blindness though. There's a number in here. If you're colorblind, if you have a red-green color blindness, you might not be able to read the number. Good luck with that. Well, our next topic is heritability. I found a pretty good definition. A lot of the definitions you get are just too simple, like something that can be inherited. That's one definition I ran into a lot. Well, we need to get more detailed than that. Heritability, the proportion of observed variation in a particular trait. It could be height, it could be for dogs, it could be the number of puppies in a litter, you name it. The proportion of the variation that can be attributed to inherited genetic factors. That means how likely are we to get these genes or traits from our parents, okay? And then of course your grandparents are in there and the great-grandparents, in contrast to environmental factors. So I do want to remind you that earlier we had this formula. I didn't spell it all out, but the P here is for the phenotype. That's what you see. For example, height. If you remember right, I think a while ago we said height is a polygenic trait. There's going to be many genes that kind of go into it, or at least more than one. Anyway, the phenotype, I'm back here to this formula, is equal to the genotype, that's the alleles that you have, plus environmental factors. And I remember we said the environmental factors can be prenatal, maternal environment, postnatal, maternal environment, and then the environment the animal is raised in. And I've got a chart here that shows like even the time that you were raised has an influence on these factors. So I'm going to get this up out of the way. Maybe I'll leave that there so you can see that. Put that up there because I've got a couple different illustrations. I thought this was interesting. This is talking about mental conditions in people, and the y-axis goes up to 90. Heritability is between 0 and 100%. Sometimes it's given in charts as percent or sometimes decimal. So my next chart actually has decimal. So if you see something about heritability is 0.35, that's basically like saying 35% on this figure. Well, they've got a number of conditions listed. There's a reference there if you want to look it up. But bipolar disorder, more than 80% heritable, and schizophrenia, very highly heritable. For most things, you won't see heritability in the 80%. That's phenomenal. That means environment doesn't have a whole lot to do with it, which is a little depressing. I hate to say that, but you know, man, sometimes genes do control a lot, and that's an example there. Holy smokes. Well, let me get the other one over here. It's got some more examples, more animal examples. So let me make sure this fits here on the screen. And in this case, heritability is on this x-axis, and it's in the decimal form. So the other one had percent, and you could say if it's 0.50, that's 50% heritable. So we can go up here, and you can see on this chart, very few things are even 50% heritable. Like let's say birds have a length of a bone. Cattle, yearling weight, that's what, about 35%. I thought it was interesting here, human height, these two figures, over 80% heritable if you lived in Finland, if you were born in Finland between 47 and 1957. And then look at this, the heritability drops to 70% before 1929. Maybe that has something to do with nutrition or the way the weather was. I have no idea. Down here, fitness traits, I thought it was interesting. Cattle, bull fertility, very lowly heritable. That means it's hard to make progress in how fertile a bull is by selecting. So the kicker is, and I didn't say that before, but if heritability is low, it's hard to select for the trait because there's so many environmental factors that are going on that you can select good bulls for fertility and not make a lot of progress. So the more something is heritable, the more likely you are able to make progress by selecting the right dam and sire. Okay? Like for example, down here, I'm still down here. Number of piglets born alive, only 10% heritable. That's pretty low. So if you're below 20-25%, that's usually lowly heritable. If you're in the 30s to 40, most people would call that moderately heritable. And usually if you're above 60 or more, that's phenomenal. And that's, you can make a lot of progress by genetic selection. Finally, we're going to talk about inbreeding and outbreeding. I guess those are antonyms of each other. Let me do the definition for inbreeding. The act of mating closely related individuals. Okay? And outbreeding then would be just the opposite, the act of mating unrelated individuals. And so since we're talking about genetics, I want to tell you what it does to the alleles. Okay, here's a nice little graphic illustration, and we've got capital A, which is a dominant allele, and then we have the little a, lowercase a, which is a recessive deleterious allele. Deleterious means something bad is going to happen if two copies are present, right? Well, look at the parents. It doesn't say which is which, but let's say this is the sire. The sire is a carrier, so it's not going to be expressing that recessive trait, but it's going to carry it. And let's say the dam is over here and she doesn't have any copies of it. Well, when you mate those two individuals, they've got 3 offspring showing. You got the A, of course you're only going to get 2 types of, we haven't done the Punnett square yet, but all you've got is, you've got 3 capital A's and then 1 little a, so this one, this dam can only contribute large A. And so you'd have large A, and large A, little a. So there's large A, little a, and then large A, little a. So these are like the 3 offspring from these parents. Well, lo and behold, then inbreeding is the act of mating closely related individuals. So then here we're mating siblings. Okay, and if we did that, that would be called inbreeding. And they're both carriers. They didn't have to be because this one isn't a carrier, but in this illustration, they're both carriers. So if you have both parents carriers, that means a proportion of the offspring are going to have 2 copies of the recessive deleterious allele, and therefore that's when it's going to be expressed. And they're not showing you all the possible matings. We can do that when we do the Punnett squares. But you're going to get expression there because you've got 2 little a's. Outbreeding is bringing an individual that's not related in, and so this is an illustration. So this is outbreeding. An individual from the outside comes in and mates, and you get, there's no chance of getting little a, is there, right? This is kind of like a duplication of up here. So this mating is going to give you these possibilities. Anyway, the point is, where's my little dragger here? Inbreeding increases homozygosity, tends to increase homozygosity. What does that mean? That means you're going to get more little a, but you're also going to get more big A. So it's not like inbreeding is automatically bad, because if there are no deleterious genes in the population you're inbreeding, you're not going to get the expression of the deleterious alleles because they're not there. But in the general population, you tend to increase homozygosity due to inbreeding. Outbreeding then is just the opposite. You increase heterozygosity, and that means you're less likely to get two deleterious recessive alleles sitting on the same locus. So this is outbreeding, this is inbreeding, and there's all kinds of terms that the dog breeders use, and it's amazing. But a lot of times our purebred dogs have some degree of inbreeding because the populations are relatively small, and we tend then to get some genetic disorders that we wouldn't get if we had a bigger population and did more outbreeding. Okay, it's been fun. Let's see. Yes, and here's the list of those fine illustrations that I used. See you next time.